In the year 1984, in one of the American prisons, the guard responsible for the outer gate received a call from the prison supervisor. The supervisor informed him that there was a bomb in building number 1 and instructed him to open the prison gates, take the prison van, and bring it to the building immediately. This prison was surrounded by 2 fences, and the prison entrance consisted of 2 gates facing each other. Prison regulations strictly prohibit both gates from being opened simultaneously. However, due to the emergency of a bomb threat, the gate guard decided to break the rules and open both gates at once. After that, the van entered the prison, and when it reached the building with the bomb, the explosives team emerged, dressed in their heavy gear and carrying the bomb with them. One of them was calmly extinguishing the bomb with a fire extinguisher, trying to reduce its heat to prevent it from detonating. The explosives team placed the bomb in the van and immediately exited the prison through the open gates. The guards, witnessing this scene, believed that they had averted a catastrophe. Little did they know that this was just the beginning of their ordeal. The 6 members of the explosives team, who had exited through the open prison gates, weren't a special force or an explosive team. Actually, they were prisoners, and not even ordinary prisoners. All 6 of them were sentenced to death, each one a notorious murderer, some even serial killers. Now there were 6 escaped killers on the loose, ready to do anything to remain free. Needless to say, the events that followed this escape were crazy. But even before delving into that, how did they manage to pull off this daring escape? Where did they get the bomb? How did they get out of their cells? And how did they acquire the guards' uniforms? If you want answers, follow the story. Huge shout out to today's episode's sponsor, Candlestick. AI is becoming more powerful and more useful in different areas of our lives, from art to programming. AI can even help us make better investing decisions. Hedge funds and institutional investors have been using AI for years to give themselves an unfair advantage and produce profit. Regular investors haven't had that same option until now. Candlestick is an app that gives you an AI investing co-pilot. Candlestick's AI models practice over past data until they can achieve superhuman trading performance in the stock market. Regular investors have used the model's recommendations to beat the market and make thousands in both 2021 and 2022. Of course, you have to trust your investment decisions, and nobody wants to just be told what to do by some higher authority, human or AI, without understanding why. That's why Candlestick is using generative AI to explain every recommendation and answer any question you might have about finance, investing, or specific stocks. Traditional finance is a one-way street. With AI, it can be a two-way street. No need to commit right away, though. Candlestick is extending a special offer to Robbers IQ subscribers. Use the link below to try it out for free until you're ready to dive in. Investing is hard. Let AI lend a helping hand. Now back to our story. Our story unfolds in the state of Virginia, United States, specifically in the Mecklenburg prison, which was known for its high security measures. In this prison, there was a special section that housed inmates sentenced to death. This section was located in building number 1, and this is the very building from which the condemned prisoners escaped. The escape took place on May 31, 1984, at 11 o'clock at night. As soon as the escape was discovered, a massive alert was triggered. All the authorities, including the police, the FBI, and the governor's office, were mobilized. This was the first time in American history that prisoners sentenced to death had managed to escape from prison. With 6 escaped killers on the loose, there was no room for delay. They had to be apprehended immediately. The search operation commenced immediately after the escape was uncovered. Helicopters were in the air, vehicles flooded the streets, and officers and police dogs were on the ground. A gradual search of the area surrounding the prison, spanning several kilometers, was initiated, and the military and National Guard were put on high alert. The Virginia State FBI sent its top investigators to handle the case. All officials were deeply concerned about the safety of the public and citizens. If any of these prisoners were to cross paths with anyone, it could turn into a disaster. The condemned killers can easily take someone's life, whether they need to or just for the thrill of it. They might even kill without provocation, with no conscience or fear of punishment. They were already sentenced to death after all. The investigators arrived at the prison, where they were met by the prison warden. They began to extract details from the warden. He explained that when they entered Section C of Building 1, they found everything in chaos. The place had been turned upside down, and the guards were restrained. It was the prisoners who had taken control of the section. The investigators inquired about the identities of the escaped prisoners, and it was immediately evident that the news was not promising. As we mentioned earlier, all 6 of them were killers, but 2 stood out as the most dangerous: James Briley and Linwood Briley. These 2 were, in fact, brothers and leaders of a gang. Their victim count ranged from 11 to 20 people, and all of their murders had been particularly brutal. Let me give you an example. In one of their crimes, James Briley assaulted a woman in front of her husband and their 5-year-old son, then proceeded to kill the entire family, including the 5-year-old child. The 3rd prisoner, Earl Clanton, killed an elderly woman and was subsequently granted parole, pending a full trial. During this period of parole, he killed another woman who worked as a school librarian. He stabbed her 8 times in the head and then strangled her to death. The 4th prisoner, Lem Tuggle, was convicted of assaulting and killing 2 elderly women as well, both in their 60s. The 5th prisoner, Derek Peterson, robbed a supermarket of $6,000 and then killed the store manager. He stole and then murdered. The 6th and final prisoner, Willie Jones, broke into the home of an elderly couple, killed the husband, asked the wife to pray for him, and then killed her before setting the house on fire. Now, I believe you understand the severity of these 6 criminals and why the officials were terrified of their escape. The lead investigator handling the case was confident that they would eventually capture them, but what worried him was the possibility of them harming or killing innocent people. Outside the investigative units, the police throughout the state were actively involved in the operation, setting up roadblocks and checkpoints as the search radius expanded with each passing moment. The longer it took, the farther the prisoners could have gone, possibly in any direction: east, west, north, or south. The investigators desperately sought any lead that could point them in the right direction. Their first step was to examine Section C, the very section from which the prisoners had escaped. When they entered, they found the section in disarray. As we mentioned earlier, when the escape was first discovered, the guards had been restrained and held captive. The investigators entered the prisoners' cells, searching meticulously, but found no clues or leads that could indicate where the prisoners might have gone. However, they did uncover makeshift knives and sharp objects that the prisoners had crafted within the prison, cleverly hidden in various places. For instance, they discovered a knife concealed within one of the table legs. The investigators had learned that the escaped prisoners were armed with edged weapons and knives, which increased the level of danger they posed. After completing their search of the cells, the investigators turned their attention to interrogating the guards from Section C, who had been found bound and restrained. They began by asking the guards if they had any information about where the prisoners had gone after their escape. However, the guards denied hearing anything from the prisoners while they were captive. They claimed that the prisoners hadn't discussed or mentioned any specific destination. The investigators' suspicions started to shift toward the guards themselves. It was possible that one of them had assisted the prisoners in their escape. After all, the building or section from which the prisoners had escaped was supposed to be highly secure, with robust security measures in place. The investigators were well aware that prison guards were among the individuals most susceptible to bribery, especially given their less than adequate salaries and hard-working conditions. Especially the guards, who often complained about being mistreated by the inmates. So, the investigators sat down with the guards and questioned them about what had transpired. They inquired about how the prisoners had managed to overpower them, take their uniforms, and escape the building so easily. Initially, the guards informed them that about 2 months prior, one of the prisoners in Section C had sent an anonymous message to the state prosecutor's office. The message contained a warning that there was a bomb inside Section C, and the prisoners intended to use it as part of an escape plan. The message was anonymous, and the identity of the prisoner who sent it was unknown. However, it ultimately led the prison warden to order a group of supervisors and guards to conduct searches and inspections in Section C. They entered the prisoners' cells one by one, searched their belongings, and even trained dogs with them. But they found no trace of a bomb or any materials that could be used to create one. The message sent by the anonymous prisoner claimed that the bomb was being prepared as part of a breakout plan for some of the inmates. The investigators now suspect that this report may have been a fabrication by the same prisoners planning the escape. The purpose might have been to make the guards believe in the bomb threat when they executed their escape plan. Nonetheless, the investigators felt that some of the guards, or perhaps at least one of them, might have been involved in this operation. They began questioning the guards one by one about the details of the events that had transpired in the section just before the prisoners escaped. Through the guards' testimonies and accounts, the investigators started piecing together in their minds how the prisoners had escaped. On the day of the escape, the prisoners were engaged in outdoor activities allowed for specific hours. They were playing basketball in the prison yard, and 5 guards were supervising them. Along with another prisoner, Willie Turner, approached a guard. They informed the guard that they wanted to return to their cells earlier than scheduled. One of them claimed to have a knee injury, while the other said he needed to use the restroom. The problem was that this action violated prison policies. In general, prisoners were required to spend the entire allocated time on outdoor activities outside their cells. If one or more prisoners wanted to return to their cells prematurely, all the prisoners should return as well. The problem arose because 2 out of the 5 guards had accompanied the 2 prisoners who requested to return to their cells, leaving the remaining inmates in the prison yard under the supervision of only 3 guards. The decrease in guards' numbers made it simpler for the prisoners to engage in any activity without the guards noticing them. This situation unfolded when the scheduled outdoor activities concluded. The guards informed the prisoners that their time was up, and it was time to return to the building and their cells. When the prisoners and the 3 guards started heading back, the guards were not particularly attentive or focused on them. They didn't anticipate anything unusual happening. As they entered the building, an additional guard responsible for the gate was also present. This guard had a control panel with buttons that could open and close the electronically operated doors throughout the section. The guards had been lax in adhering to prison policies and rules, to the extent that they hadn't even counted the prisoners. This should have been a basic protocol. Suddenly, chaos erupted among the prisoners as they pushed and raised their voices. At that moment, the prisoners were still in the area near the gate. They had entered through the outer gate, but had not yet reached the inner gate that led to the cells. The 3 guards and the gatekeeper were drawn to the commotion and disorder created by the prisoners and failed to notice one of the prisoners as he opened the door to the restroom located nearby and entered it. This particular restroom was designated for the guards, and the prisoner who entered it was Earl Clanton. His mission was to stay in the restroom and await a specific signal from his accomplices. The plan was for him to remain inside the restroom, holding the lock from the inside, so that even if someone attempted to enter, they would feel that someone was inside or that the lock was jammed. Outside the restroom, the guards were trying to regain control over the chaos the prisoners had incited. Indeed, moments later, the prisoners suddenly quieted down because their intended goal had been achieved when Earl Clanton entered the restroom successfully. Since the guards did not check on them and even didn't count them as they entered, they were unaware that one of them was missing. The prisoners knew that the guards did not even follow basic protocols. After things had calmed down, the guards opened the door to the cell area and ushered the prisoners inside, moving them away from the gate area. As for Clanton, he remained hidden in the restroom. After some time, One of the guards attempted to open the restroom door, but the lock wouldn't budge because Clanton was holding it from the inside. When this guard signaled to another guard responsible for the gate, he gestured for him to go and use another toilet. Even though prison rules dictated that if any door remained locked or jammed, maintenance personnel should be immediately summoned to address the issue. However, this protocol was also ignored by the guards. In building number 1 of the prison, there were 3 sections: Section A, Section B, and Section C. The Section C housed the inmates sentenced to death. This section was further divided into 2 zones, each separated from the other. Between these 2 zones was the gate control room for Section C, where the guard responsible for the gates was stationed. According to this guard, the prisoner's escape plan began when one of them knocked on the window pane to get his attention. This particular prisoner had a book, and he wanted to give it to another prisoner in the second zone of Section C. This prisoner, located in the same zone, wished to pass the book to another inmate who was separated by the gate control room. The prisoner communicated with the gate guard through the telephone connecting the cell area and the gate control room. He asked the guard to deliver the book to James Briley, one of the 2 sibling killers we talked about earlier. The gate guard agreed to the request and left the gate control room, leaving the door slightly ajar, which was a habit of the gate guards. The prisoners had already noticed it, so they decided to exploit this opportunity in their plan. Meanwhile, the prisoners within the cell area were preparing themselves for the escape operation. One of the prisoners, Willie Turner, possessed remarkable craftsmanship skills. He could fashion knives and sharp weapons from almost nothing, using materials obtained from the restroom or the edges of doors. He honed these improvised weapons with stones until they became sharp, cleverly concealing them in books, tables, or other places where it would be difficult for the guards to detect them. The investigators believed he was the mastermind behind the entire operation due to his intelligence. However, remember that Willie Turner is not the same individual as Willie Jones, one of the 6 escapees. In reality, Willie Turner had no intention of escaping, despite being the principal figure and planner of this entire operation. We will delve further into this point later. So, the plan began with the book, just as we mentioned earlier. The gatekeeper took the book and left the control room, leaving the door slightly ajar. He went to the opposite door to give it to the second prisoner in the second cell area. When the guard handed the book to the second prisoner, James Briley, he raised his voice and thanked him for the book. This was the signal that Clanton, who was hiding in the bathroom, had been waiting for. As soon as Clanton heard this phrase, he quickly left the bathroom and entered the gate control room. He pressed the button that opened the gates to the cell area, and suddenly, all the doors swung open and chaos ensued. The prisoners grabbed their weapons and attacked the guards. In the blink of an eye, the guards became the prisoners, and the prisoners became the guards. Within minutes, the prisoners had taken control of the entire section. They tied up every guard in the section, confiscated their batons, and even took their wallets and personal belongings. Now that the prisoners had taken over Section C, they isolated it from the rest of the prison buildings. The next step was to capture a high-ranking officer, because the guards who were initially in their custody couldn't issue orders to open the main gate, so they needed a high-ranking officer to do this. Under duress, one of the guards called one of the supervisors in the prison. He told him that there was an emergency in Section C, and that one of the prisoners had been injured as a result of a fight that broke out between him and another inmate. The guard asked the supervisor to come to assess the situation personally and oversee it. This supervisor held the rank of lieutenant but was far from the section in question. He couldn't arrive quickly, so he sent the officer responsible for the shift, who held a lower rank than the lieutenant. When the officer entered the section, he saw the guard in the gate control room and asked him to let him in. What the officer didn't know was that this person in the control room wasn't a guard at all, but one of the prisoners who had taken one of the guard's uniforms and pretended to be the gatekeeper. Once he got in, the officer was taken aback as the prisoners attacked him and tied him up. He couldn't do anything, and he didn't have a chance to contact anyone outside. In the same way, the prisoners continued to lure guards and officers of various ranks into the section. When the guard or officer arrived in the section, they would be apprehended, stripped of their clothes, and locked up with their colleagues. Even the nurse who was responsible for this section was taken captive, and they locked her up alone in a cell. Then one of the criminals, Clanton, entered her cell with the intention of assaulting her. The nurse began to scream and plead for help. The guards who were being held captive below heard the nurse's cries, but they were powerless to do anything. Briley joined his partner, Clanton, in the assault on the nurse. However, one of the prisoners entered the cell and began to berate them for their actions. Following that, Willie Turner, the mastermind, entered to make them stop the assault. Indeed, these criminals ceased their actions and left the nurse alone. The nurse herself later recounted these events during her interrogation by the investigators. At this moment, the investigators were trying to piece together the events through the testimonies of the guards. However, at the same time, the criminals were still on the run, with no trace of them. 2 hours had passed since the escape operation, and the police knew that the longer time went by, the more difficult it would be to find them. They were expanding the search every half hour, with all available law enforcement resources in the state dedicated to the operation. Despite all these efforts, there was no sign of the criminals. The investigators continued to interrogate the guards and prison officers. Each guard recounted how they were detained and bound by the prisoners who had donned their uniforms. Every time they apprehended a guard, the prisoners would take their clothes and disguise themselves as more guards. According to the guards' testimonies, James Briley, one of the brothers, had contemplated killing some of the guards. However, Willie Turner, the mastermind behind the operation, convinced him to abandon the idea, explaining that any further murders would only complicate their situation. Now, let's go back to the lieutenant who supervised the prison. Initially, he had been contacted, but instead, he sent the officer responsible for the shift to his place. This lieutenant attempted to communicate with the guards in Section C to assess the situation, but there was no response to his calls. Even the officer he sent to the section didn't contact him or provide any information. The lieutenant found this unusual and decided to go to Section C himself to see what was happening. When he entered the section, he was shocked to find chaos everywhere. The lieutenant didn't enter through the main door, but rather through a side entrance. As he entered through the side door, it automatically closed behind him. Suddenly, as he surveyed the area, the prisoners who had been disguised as guards ambushed and restrained him, and then detained him with the others. Now that they had a lieutenant, things became easier for the criminals. They decided to initiate their escape from the prison. First, they took the guards and locked them in the janitor's room located within Section C, sealing the door shut. The only person they brought with them was the lieutenant. At this point, they were still in Section C, which was housed in Building Number 1. They had control over the control room that managed the doors in Section C. However, there was another control room at the main entrance of Building Number 1, which had a duty guard inside. This control room had doors that could be locked from all directions, making it impossible for the prisoners to access it unless the duty guard herself opened the doors. To ensure that the guard would open the doors for them, the prisoners coerced the lieutenant into making a call to the female guard. They made him tell her that another guard would come to take her place. Although the request seemed somewhat unusual, the female guard didn't raise any objections, trusting her immediate superior's word. Earl Clanton and Derek Peterson emerged at this time and moved in the direction of the gate control room. When the guard saw them, she promptly opened the door, oblivious to the fact that these were prisoners disguised as guards, especially since her direct superior had informed her that another guard would take her place. The two prisoners entered the room, seized the guard, and bound her. This way, the prisoners gained control over all the doors in Building Number 1. However, a significant obstacle still lay ahead of them: the large external gate, the prison's main entrance, consisting of two adjacent gates that, as we previously mentioned, were not supposed to be opened simultaneously. But the prisoners had the lieutenant, and he had the authority to open any door and issue any orders to the guards. So, they coerced the lieutenant again into calling the guard at the external gate. As I mentioned earlier in the events we discussed in the introduction, the lieutenant told the gate guard that there was a bomb in Section C. He instructed the guard to open both gates simultaneously and quickly bring the prison van to building number 1. What aided the guard in believing the story was the message sent by the unknown prisoner about a bomb in Section C, along with the search operations conducted by the guards because of it. Now, the situation was more believable, and most likely, as we mentioned before, it was the prisoners themselves who had written this message to plant the idea in the guards' minds as the escape operations date approached. The guard promptly carried out the lieutenant's instructions, opening both gates and directing the prison van towards building number 1. Meanwhile, one of the prisoners grabbed a small television from one of their cells. The plan was to cover it with a blanket and pretend that it was a bomb. It's important to note that not all the prisoners involved in this operation intended to escape. Some of them had to remain in the control rooms to facilitate the opening of doors. They didn't all aim to escape. They just wanted to be part of the operation. Even Willie Turner, the mastermind of the operation, didn't escape because he had an ongoing appeal against his death sentence and wanted to wait for the appeal's outcome, so he chose to stay in prison to avoid missing it. However, because he participated in this escape operation and assisted his fellow inmates, with many witnesses to this fact, it's likely that the appeal would not work in his favor. Those who did escape were only 6, the same 6 we mentioned before. Before leaving the building, these 6 criminals forcibly entered a room containing riot control equipment meant for the guards. They took some helmets and shields, and used a stretcher meant for the injured to conceal the television. They covered the television with a blanket to make it appear as if it were a bomb. When they donned the helmets and the heavy equipment, their identities became even more concealed, and any guard who saw them believed they were part of a specialized unit. The guard at the main prison gate brought the van and parked it at the entrance of building number 1, completely unaware of what was happening inside the prison. All he knew was that there was a bomb inside the building. Suddenly, the prisoners, still in disguise, burst out of the building and shouted at the guard to flee the area immediately, claiming they had a live and highly dangerous bomb that could explode at any moment. One of them even pretended to extinguish it with a fire extinguisher. The guard, in his fear and confusion, believed them and quickly fled, thinking they were a specialized explosives unit. The prisoners then got into the van and simply drove out of the open prison gates. This was the story of the escape and the details the investigators managed to gather from interrogating the guards. Unfortunately, this interrogation and the information extracted from them didn't provide the investigators with any leads regarding the whereabouts of the escaped inmates. 3 hours had passed since their escape without a trace, suggesting that they might have distanced themselves considerably from the prison. Now let's see the events from the perspective of the 6 inmates who successfully escaped. After leaving the prison, they continued to drive the prison van for a while, feeling a sense of exhilaration after their remarkable success. This euphoria seemingly stemmed from the fact that they were driving a prison vehicle adorned with the prison's logo and name. As they were driving, they passed by a police officer in his patrol car on his usual nightly rounds. The officer saw them, they greeted him, and he simply returned their greetings. The reason for this was that the police officer was in another state. The inmates had already managed to exit Virginia, where the prison was located, and had entered North Carolina. Therefore, news of the prison break had not yet reached the local law enforcement agencies. Moreover, this encounter occurred within the first hours of their escape, so news of the event did not spread widely. The police officer assumed that these individuals were officers transporting inmates, as they were dressed in guard uniforms. Given that prisoner transfers often occur at night, the officer had no reason to suspect them. However, after this encounter, the inmates snapped out of their euphoria and realized that they were driving a prison van, which they needed to get rid of to avoid detection. They began arguing among themselves about their destination and how to dispose of the vehicle. One of them suggested finding a forested area to hide the van among the trees. Yet this plan would take time, and they were anxious about the vehicle potentially exposing them. After driving for a while longer, they reached a small town called Warrenton. There, they spotted a secluded spot amidst the trees and decided to park the van there. After hastily exiting the van, the inmates split into two groups. The first group consisted of 4 individuals: the Briley Brothers, Willie Jones, and William Taggart. The second group comprised Earl Clanton and Derek Peterson. The 4 members of the first group began running through the trees and forests, relying on luck to guide them. They struck gold when they stumbled upon some clothes hanging on a washing line in front of one of the houses. Without hesitation, they removed the clothes worn by the guards and donned civilian attire to blend in more effectively. At this point, 3.5 hours had passed since the beginning of their escape. Finally, after all this time, the police managed to catch their first lead. A patrol car happened to be near the spot where the inmates had left the prison van. News of the prison break had spread, even reaching the police in North Carolina. When the officer in the patrol car spotted the van with the prison's name and logo, he alerted his colleagues. They quickly surrounded the van and cautiously approached it. In the end, they discovered that it was empty, realizing that the inmates had abandoned it, and continued on foot. Inside the vehicle, they found helmets and the equipment the prisoners had used. The van was about 50 kilometers away from the prison, which meant it was beyond the immediate search radius set up by the police. The news quickly reached the authorities and investigators handling the case. Immediately afterward, the Search Operations Command Center shifted to North Carolina, specifically the town of Warrenton, where they had found the van. This transformed the case into a joint effort between the authorities in both Virginia and North Carolina. Furthermore, the FBI was summoned to lead the investigation and take control of the case because it had become a federal matter. The reason was that the escaped prisoners had crossed state borders, and officially, the case now falls under the FBI's jurisdiction. The focus of the new search operation was centered on the small town where the prison van had been found. Investigators immediately surmised that the prisoners had likely split into smaller groups, as remaining together would increase the chances of recapture. Therefore, it was logical to assume that they had separated. The alert about the escaped prisoners reached every corner of the state and beyond. Even the FBI issued warnings to all law enforcement agencies across different states, informing them that 6 convicted murderers had escaped from prison and that they needed to be on high alert. If any of these fugitives entered their jurisdiction or state, they needed to be prepared. Meanwhile, at the operations center, investigators calculated distances, studied maps, and attempted to predict the locations and distances the escapees could cover every passing minute. Simultaneously, they began gathering personal information about the prisoners, their families, and the individuals they had been in contact with while incarcerated. There was a significant possibility that these criminals might seek refuge with their relatives or friends. The police established a dedicated hotline to receive any information about the fugitives. Around 5:00 a.m., a report came in from a person who claimed that his pickup truck had disappeared from in front of his house. This individual lived in the same small town, Warrenton. Within moments, the police and investigators were at his house. They first asked him about the vehicle. He described it as a blue pickup truck with a hint of red on the rear and with the vanity tag PI1. He also mentioned that it had been filled with a full tank of gas. This means that if the escaped prisoners had indeed stolen it, this information could potentially lead them to a distant location. The police immediately broadcasted information about the stolen vehicle, but they realized they needed to expand the search radius significantly, possibly even hundreds of kilometers, as the escapees could have gone anywhere with a vehicle at their disposal. Furthermore, they needed to ensure that their warnings reached law enforcement agencies in other states, especially those neighboring their own. Since the prisoners now had a vehicle, they could potentially cross state lines. Morning arrived, and the sun rose, but there was still no trace of the escaped prisoners anywhere. The police set up checkpoints on all roads, especially around the town of Warrenton. Every vehicle was stopped and inspected. All law enforcement officers in the area, from traffic cops to special forces, were mobilized for this search mission, leaving no budget constraints or resources unused. Helicopters patrolled the skies, officers scoured the ground, cars filled the streets, trained dogs joined the hunt, and every available means was put to use. However, despite these extensive efforts, they were yet to find any leads. However, this massive search operation and the intimidating presence of law enforcement had unintended consequences. The police hadn't accounted for the fear that would grip the townsfolk. Imagine waking up to the roar of helicopters and the blare of police sirens, only to find police checkpoints on every street. Later, they would learn from the news that 6 dangerous killers had escaped from prison and had been in their town the previous night. The residents of Warrenton were now terrified, fearing they might encounter one of these criminals in the street, criminals with nothing to lose who could potentially kill anyone in their path. Even people in neighboring counties and areas were also frightened, as the news suggested that these criminals could be anywhere. To make matters worse, the media and television channels began discussing the dark past of these criminals, including the heinous crimes they had committed. This included attacks on elderly women in their 70s, the murder of entire families, and even the killing of a 5-year-old child after witnessing his parents' murders. As a result, the residents of Warrenton and the surrounding areas flocked to gun shops in a frenzy, buying firearms and ammunition. The situation escalated to the point where gun shops completely sold out of their inventory, with not a single weapon or bullet left in stock. Everything was sold. The additional problem was that people were even afraid of the officers and policemen. They knew that the criminals had disguised themselves in guard uniforms. So when the police occasionally knocked on people's doors to question or interview them, they faced significant resistance. People were unwilling to cooperate or even open their doors. Many people had barricaded themselves inside their homes, locking their doors and refusing to open them to anyone. They took shifts within their families, ensuring that there was always someone awake and alert for anything that might happen, armed with a weapon. The police, in their efforts to help the citizens, especially women and the elderly who needed groceries or supplies from the market, offered assistance by personally shopping for them. In general, the people in the town and the surrounding areas were terrified. This fear had a significant impact on the volume of calls received by the police. Every minute, they received calls reporting sightings of one of the criminals somewhere. However, on the same day, which was one day after the night of the escape, on the 1st of June 1984, precisely at 5 p.m., Earl Clanton and Derek Peterson confidently strolled the streets of the town in broad daylight. It's unclear whether they were trying to outsmart everyone by walking confidently, assuming that no one would suspect them if they were in plain sight. Of course, they had discarded their guard uniforms and changed into different clothes, but Clanton still wore the guard's jacket, but he had removed the insignia and labels. They entered a laundry shop because they wanted a secluded place to eat some of the food they had bought from a grocery store. They were searching for any place nearby where they could eat, and the laundry shop was the only option they found. Unfortunately, at that very moment, one of the police patrols passed by the shop. The head of the prison's emergency response team was in charge of this patrol. This leader had excellent knowledge of prison guard uniforms. As soon as his eyes fell on the laundry shop, he immediately noticed the jacket that Clanton was wearing. Although it lacked the typical markings and logos found on guard uniforms, he could identify it by its color and design. He swiftly directed the vehicle toward the shop, along with his assistant, both armed. They entered the shop, and inside, they found Clanton there. He ordered them to raise their hands and place them against the wall. The period of freedom that the two of them experienced outside prison did not exceed 19 hours, and these are genuine snapshots of their moments of arrest inside the shop. While this should generally have been a joyful piece of news, it was equally terrifying, especially for the town's residents. They were struck with fear upon learning that the police had apprehended two criminals who were casually walking the streets and entering shops. Suddenly, even those who hadn't been scared before became frightened, realizing that these criminals could have been among them all along. Investigators were particularly apprehensive about the Briley brothers, as they were among the most brutal in this group of criminals. They could be classified as cold-blooded killers because they had committed multiple acts of murder and assault without apparent reason. Once they killed a pregnant woman, and on another occasion, they brutally attacked a 79-year-old woman, killing her and her husband. On another occasion, they brutally murdered a 5-year-old child, along with his entire family, adding to their list of heinous and violent crimes. What made matters worse was their complete lack of remorse after being apprehended. The Briley brothers were at the top of the priority list for both the police and investigators. However, the search operations persisted, and the police continued to grapple with the overwhelming volume of frantic calls. Despite the sheer volume of these frantic reports, security forces made every effort to respond to and engage with as many of them as possible, especially those reports they believed might lead to something substantial. Officers scoured through forests, mud, and mire, trudging through swamps and lakes, and even exploring abandoned houses. But despite all these efforts, none of the reports yielded any useful results in the end. However, even without the reports, the police's efforts remained relentless. On that fateful night, at 11:00 p.m. in the city of Portsmouth in the state of Virginia, which was approximately 300 kilometers away from the town of Warrenton, a police patrol was driving down the road when they spotted two individuals attempting to steal a car. One of the officers exited the vehicle and ordered the individuals to raise their hands. However, these two individuals immediately fled, and when the officer attempted to chase them, they opened fire. It was later confirmed that these individuals were indeed the Briley brothers. Their gunfire at the officer only heightened the investigators' concerns. These two were ready to kill, even the police, to maintain their freedom. The additional problem was that they had been located in a city that was 300 kilometers away from the Central Search Operations Base in Warrenton, where the prison van had been found. Now, the investigators needed to find alternative ways to locate them, and their first idea was to monitor the family and relatives of the Briley brothers. The FBI reviewed the prison's call records and identified the numbers and people the Briley brothers had been contacting from inside the prison. However, they realized that many of these numbers and names were random, with no apparent connection to the Brileys, indicating that the brothers had deliberately provided false information about the numbers and people they were contacting from inside the prison. Therefore, the FBI obtained call records directly from the telecommunications company, which contained the real identities of the individuals the Briley brothers had contacted from the prison. Among those contacts, the most frequent was their uncle. FBI agents visited the uncle's house, but they kept their distance and inquired about the calls. They didn't want to raise suspicions that might lead to the uncle warning the Briley brothers and allowing them to escape. So, a dedicated team was assigned the task of monitoring the uncle's activities and tracking his every move. They knew that the Briley brothers were unlikely to stay at the uncle's house, but there might be other types of communication or meetings. The idea was to continue monitoring the uncle until the moment he communicated with or met the Briley brothers. They continued to observe him and follow his movements for several days. We will return to them later to see what happened after this surveillance operation. Now let's go back to the other prisoners. During these days, when the FBI was monitoring the uncle, they obtained a new lead related to the second pair of criminals, Lem Tuggle and Willie Jones. These two prisoners had taken 8 days to reach the state of Vermont, where they were hiding in one of its forests. Vermont is located near the Canadian border, and their ultimate goal was to reach Canada. They had found a secluded spot in Vermont's forests to spend their nights, but a problem arose. They were running low on fuel in their pickup truck and needed to refuel to continue their journey to Canada. As I mentioned earlier, the Briley brothers were part of a group with Lem Tuggle and Willie Jones. Together, the four of them found the pickup truck and stole it from its owner's front yard. The owner reported to the police that the truck was blue with a hint of red at the back and had a distinctive license plate PI1. However, the morning after they left the town, the Briley brothers split from Lem Tuggle and Willie Jones. They told them that someone would come, and they would go with him. Anyway, Lem Tuggle and Willie Jones took the pickup truck and headed toward Vermont. Their goal was to reach Canada, but they needed fuel for the truck. Lem Tuggle left Willie Jones in the woods and drove the truck to a nearby town called Stamford, specifically a shop that sold antiques and gifts. He entered the store and began talking to the owner. Moments later, he brandished a knife and demanded all the money she had. Faced with no other choice, the store owner complied with the threat and handed over all the cash she had. Lem Tuggle then quickly left the store, ran to the pickup truck, and drove away. However, the store owner managed to run after them and get a glimpse of the car's appearance and license plate number. Immediately, she called the police and reported the incident. Lem Tuggle had taken approximately $80 from the store owner, which wasn't a significant amount, but it was enough for fuel to get them to Canada. Their plan was for Lem Tuggle to return to pick up Willie Jones, who was waiting for him in the forest. Afterward, they would continue their journey to Canada together. Unfortunately for him, the police response to the store owner's call was faster than expected. Once the police received the report, they quickly realized that the stolen car might be connected to the prison break at Mecklenburg, an operation every police officer in the town had heard about. The town was small, with few residents and limited streets. Accidentally, there was a plainclothes officer on the street at the time. He was taken by surprise when the stolen car passed him in the opposite direction. He immediately turned around, activated the police lights, and sounded the siren, initiating a pursuit. Lem Tuggle, of course, did not stop and continued to drive, attempting to escape. However, the pursuing officer contacted other police units, and a patrol car close to their location swiftly joined the chase. The plan was for the second officer to act like a roadblock, forcing the suspect to stop. So once he reached a point he deemed suitable, he blocked the road with his car, exiting with his weapon aimed in the direction from which the suspect's car was expected to come. The police were aware of the danger, as they had confirmed that this man was likely one of the death row inmates who had escaped from prison. The situation was tense, especially since this was a rural police force, unaccustomed to high-speed chases, armed confrontations, and such incidents. The question remained, would the suspect stop when he saw the police car blocking the road with an officer aiming a weapon at him, or would he resist? The officer remained fully focused. If the suspect did not stop, he would have to open fire. Fortunately, Lem Tuggle stopped the car as he reached the makeshift roadblock. He surrendered, and the police arrested him. And these are some real pictures taken at the moment of his arrest. Afterward, he expressed regret for robbing the store and wished he had chosen a different target. On the day following the arrest of Willie Jones, who had been waiting for his partner in the woods, an unusual and bizarre turn of events unfolded when Willie Jones reported himself. That day, Willie Jones called the police emergency line and informed the operator that his name was Willie Jones. He explained that he was one of the inmates who had escaped from Mecklenburg Prison, but now he was tired and wanted to turn himself in. The operator was taken aback and asked him about his location. Willie provided a description of the area where he was but couldn't pinpoint his exact whereabouts. However, the operator managed to deduce his location from his description, informed him that a patrol car would be sent to pick him up, and asked him to stand in a clear spot. Willie Jones assured her that they would find him on the side of the road. Indeed, a patrol car soon arrived, driving along the designated route. They spotted Willie Jones standing at the roadside, signaling to them. Willie Jones informed the police that he was unarmed, but they approached him cautiously regardless, and then they arrested him. When the investigators later questioned him about why he had decided to surrender, he told them that he had been lost in the woods, waiting for Lem Tuggle. After a full day passed with no sign, he grew uncertain about his fate. He thought either something had happened to him or perhaps he had abandoned him and fled to Canada on his own. Willie Jones found himself in a difficult situation, deep in the forest, hungry and unable to find anything to eat. He reached a point of desperation and decided to turn himself in. What saddened Willie Jones afterward was the discovery that he had been only a few kilometers away from the Canadian border. He could have walked there, and the border was not heavily guarded, making it relatively easy to cross. Unfortunately, he realized this too late. Now, 4 out of the 6 escaped inmates had been captured, but the 2 most dangerous ones remained free. The Briley brothers, as mentioned before, were of particular interest to the investigators. Lem Tuggle and Willie Jones informed the investigators that they had separated from the Briley brothers the morning of the next day of the escape, and they had no idea where they might be. The FBI had no leads or clues to follow in their search for the Briley brothers, except for their uncle. They had been closely monitoring him, believing that he was the person the Briley brothers would contact or might have already contacted from prison. They continued to observe him for several days, but each day ended without any communication or meeting with the Briley brothers. Finally, patience paid off. One day, while they were tailing him, they followed him to a car dealership. To their surprise, a woman had filed a police report indicating that James Briley had contacted her, and when they traced the number he had used to call her, it led them to the same dealership. It's certainly no coincidence that their uncle ended up at the same store. They must have had a connection to this place. In reality, the store owner had met the Briley brothers through their uncle, who had introduced them using false names instead of their real ones. As both the uncle and the store owner were acquaintances, the FBI had developed significant suspicions about the store's involvement. They had days of surveillance on the location, but with no results. However, on June 19, 1984, their surveillance unit observed 2 men working on a car in front of the store. These men bore a resemblance to the Briley brothers, but the investigators weren't entirely sure of their identities. So they sent an undercover operative from the same neighborhood to approach them, strike up a conversation, and confirm their identities. The operative smoothly integrated himself into a discussion with those 2 men, displaying no signs of suspicion. He spoke and behaved just like one of the locals, successfully blending in with them. After a brief interaction, the operative returned to the investigators and confirmed that one of the men was indeed James Briley, but the other individual was not his brother. Now, the investigators had at least pinpointed James's location, but the problem was that they didn't want to apprehend him without knowing where his brother was. They wanted to capture both brothers simultaneously. Fortunately, on that evening, they were able to confirm that Linwood was also present in the store. It seemed they were hosting some sort of gathering or small party with a group of friends and acquaintances. The police, once they were certain that both brothers were inside the store, wasted no time. They swiftly raided the location, taking everyone inside by surprise, especially the Briley brothers. When the police surrounded the premises, they aimed their weapons and ordered everyone to get down on the ground. Everyone else complied, dropping to the floor, but the Briley brothers, shocked and unsure of what to do, remained standing in place. These moments were filled with uncertainty as the brothers deliberated on whether to surrender or attempt to escape. The predicament was that even if they tried to flee, the police had them surrounded from all directions with their firearms trained on them. As wanted and dangerous fugitives, they were well aware that any wrong move could result in their deaths. So, after a few tense moments of contemplation, they made a wise choice and dropped to the ground, joining the others. The scene was startling and chaotic, with even the store owner, who had been sitting in his office, shocked by what he was witnessing. The Briley brothers were finally arrested, bringing an end to a 19-day pursuit. Fortunately, no one was killed or harmed during this operation, and with this, the manhunt for all 6 escaped prisoners concluded. The FBI was determined to ensure that the Briley brothers, in particular, would never escape again. Therefore, officials put in place measures to keep them under federal custody. Typically, When someone is apprehended in one state, the respective state coordinates with the state from which they escaped to facilitate the transfer of custody. Federal security agencies, like the FBI, aren't usually involved in these matters. However, in this exceptional case, the Briley brothers were held in the custody of the FBI to prevent any opportunity for them to escape again until they could be returned to the state of Virginia. In Virginia, Mecklenburg Prison had been put on lockdown. No new prisoners were admitted, and no prisoners were released for any reason. The state's governor had suspended 5 prison guards and indefinitely suspended the warden and the assistant security director. The prison was in a constant state of instability. After the escape, there were numerous instances of riots inside the prison, and at one point, inmates stabbed 2 guards with makeshift weapons. These acts of unrest were not common in the prison, but after the escape, the prisoners seemed particularly driven to cause disturbances. Daily acts of rioting became routine, resulting in major incidents, both among the inmates themselves and between inmates and guards. This created a state of chaos in the prison administration. Several changes were implemented, all aimed at preventing any similar escape attempts. For instance, restroom doors remained locked at all times, and any guard needing to use one had to possess a key to unlock the door, use the restroom, and then lock it again behind them. If any guard violated this protocol, they were immediately suspended. In addition to all that, an electronic system was installed to ensure that the 2 external gates could not be opened simultaneously. No gate would open unless the other gate was closed, and prison administration began strictly enforcing all regulations and protocols, regardless of how minor they might seem. Anyone, especially guards, who violated these rules was dismissed immediately. As for the fate of the 6 escapees, the state expedited their death sentences following the escape. Previously, they might have awaited lengthy stays in prison, during which appeals and sometimes retrials could occur. However, due to this escape, the authorities decided to expedite the implementation of their death sentences. Linwood Briley became the first to be executed in the electric chair in 1984, followed by his brother, James Briley, just 6 months later. During the same period, several other inmates who had not been involved in the escape were also executed. The rates of execution in general had significantly increased during this period. As for the remaining 4 of the 6 escapees, their time in prison was prolonged a little bit. Earl Clanton was executed in 1988, followed by Derek Peterson in 1991. Willie Jones was executed in 1993, and all of them met their fate in the electric chair. The last of them was Lem Tuggle, who was executed in 1996. However, by that time, they had suspended the use of the electric chair, so Lem Tuggle was executed by lethal injection. We previously talked about Willie Turner, the inmate who crafted the knives and masterminded the operation. However, as we mentioned, he did not escape with them because he had an appeal pending for his death sentence. He hoped that this appeal would either exonerate him or reduce his sentence, but in the end, he too was executed in 1995 by lethal injection. Every prisoner who participated in the operation or was present in Cell Block C was ultimately executed. This marks the culmination of their stories, and here we have reached the end of our story, and we hope you have enjoyed it. If you hit the like button to support this content, I would greatly appreciate it. Also, help us spread the channel by sharing our videos. Until next time.